When a U.S. president is sworn into office, they make an oath to the American people. The thing that distinguishes this oath from the oaths made by other government leaders is that the president promises to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution is the document that protects our freedoms and our democracy. It's what makes America, America, and the president's main role is to protect and defend this for us. Our wise and well-respected friend Mike has recently observed that throughout his term, President Trump has not taken the Constitution seriously, and in fact, has brazenly violated several of its articles and has threatened our constitutional freedoms. Mike is here with us today as a guest rambler to give us a close-up look at the Constitution and why we shouldn't take President Trump's actions lightly. I'll leave it to Mike for today's topic, the Constitution.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm a friend of Ben's, and he invited me to do a guest post on the Ramble, and I'm very excited to share some of my thoughts on ways that I think Donald Trump violates the Constitution. This thought kind of came to me as I was watching President Trump at one of his rallies talking about how he's such a law and order president, and yet in the meantime, he was being fined for illegally holding his rally during the pandemic in an indoor space. During this campaign, I've watched Donald Trump also violate the Hatch Act multiple times. This is a provision that makes it illegal to use federal resources or employees to give any one party an unfair advantage. And Trump regularly likes to, do campaign events hosted on federal property using federal staff. And these things are illegal. And so as I got thinking about that, I thought it would be a good way to sort of contrast Trump as a law and order leader versus the foundations of the Constitution that literally are the bedrock law of the land. So first I want to talk about a few of the articles and a few of the provisions of the First Amendment that I think Trump regularly violates in his role as president. First, I want to talk about Article 1 of the Constitution. This is the section of the Constitution that talks about separation of powers. And specifically, it talks about how Congress has the power of the purse. On many occasions, Trump has tried to bypass Congress and shift funding around, which is normally not the role of the president. That's the role of the legislative branch. Just last week, the Ninth Federal Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Trump illegally tried to move $3.6 billion of military funding from Congress-approved military projects to funding his border wall. The reason the power of the purse exists is it's one of the many checks and balances that makes it so that our president isn't a king and can't do anything he wants with the Treasury of the United States. The next one I want to talk about was Article 9. This is one of the sections that talks about limits on federal power. One of, in my opinion, Trump's worst and ongoing violations of the Constitution comes from Article 9, Clause 8. This is the Emoluments Clause, stating that members of the federal government should not be able to receive monetary payments or gifts from foreign states. Now, Trump did something very unique. He was one of the first presidents that broke precedent in not stepping down from his businesses. While he is not technically running the Trump organization, he did not. Usually, presidents will put their assets in a blind trust of some sort, meaning that they can't see or control what's happening with their investments. In this case, he let his family members continue to run the Trump Corporation. And in doing so, he's made it very easy for foreign leaders and other dignitaries or people in the United States to stay at his properties, whereby he gets a direct check from them. So it's very easy for, let's say, a Saudi Arabian delegation to stay at Trump International, and literally Trump's personal balance sheet goes up. In my view, that's a violation of the Emoluments Clause. Furthermore, Trump sort of specifically tries to violate this. He's suggested on many occasions to try and do official events at his properties. So he suggested that the G7 should be held at Trump properties. These are often at the cost of the American taxpayers, and they go to him. He's had, both Secret Service agents and other military agents been directed to stay at his properties when they travel overseas, again, enriching himself from the role. So this is part of the reason why most presidents also choose to release their tax returns, because it helps highlight where there are conflicts of interest. one of our challenges is by not seeing them officially, though the New York Times has published elements of his tax returns, you can see a linkage when a president owns a property, say, in Turkey, and then decides to do very specific things for the president of the government of Turkey. Well, you can see where those conflicts exist. And by Trump not being willing to release his tax returns, it's made it very hard to see where those conflicts exist. There's been several lawsuits over this Emoluments Clause. Some of them have lost, generally because it's been ruled that they didn't have standing, meaning they couldn't prove that they were being harmed by it. So the Democrats in the House of Representatives sued the president on this, and they've had that turned over. But there are several lawsuits that are still ongoing on the Emoluments Clause, and I suspect we'll see it eventually go to the Supreme Court. Next, I wanted to talk about the First Amendment of the Constitution, which in many ways is the most important one. This is part of the Bill of Rights, and it talks about kind of our four bedrock principles that make up the core of American democracy. The first is that Congress will make no law establishing a national religion. And, while Trump, I think, has done a good job trying to show support for Christians in general, he has specifically attacked other religions that aren't mainstream Christian. The so-called Muslim ban, which he tried to put into place pretty much the first month that he came into office, is a thinly veiled approach to discourage Muslims from immigrating to America. On multiple occasions, he's made up statements about Muslims, such as his claim that Muslims were celebrating in New Jersey on September 11th, something that no respected media organization has been able to confirm. Trump has also made fun of other religions. There's many occasions where he's made anti-Semitic comments about Jews. He's made fun of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on many occasions. And I think he's just broken with tradition in celebrating the long-established tradition that all religions are important in the United States of America, and not just Protestant, Christian, or evangelical religions. The next part of the First Amendment is the freedom of speech. In general, I think Trump is pretty good about promoting freedom of speech from people he supports, including many fringe groups. And that's okay. That's actually part of the freedom of speech, is that everyone has a right to believe what they think. But he has not been supportive on contrasting views. Trump lost a lawsuit versus the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University because Trump would regularly block people on the official presidential Twitter account. The judge said in this case, he said the First Amendment prohibits an official who uses social media for government purposes from excluding people from an otherwise open online dialogue because they say things that the official finds objectionable. This debate, as uncomfortable and as unpleasant as it frequently may be, is nonetheless a good thing, the judge wrote. In resolving this appeal, we remind the litigants and the public that if the First Amendment means anything, it means that the best response to disfavored speech on matters of public concern is more speech, not less. And I think that's something that Trump could do a better job of, is supporting those that disagree with him. The next one, and I think the one that we've seen perhaps the most, is Trump's attacks on the freedom of the press. Trump has been extremely dismissive of the media and undermined their critical role in holding the government accountable. It's true that many of these news sources may have a conservative or a liberal bent, and we can all be frustrated about that, but the U.S. has long established principles at very reputable media sources of, these companies will use multiple sources for their stories, they'll protect witnesses, and they'll generally have truth at the core of their stories. While they make mistakes often, respectable media organizations will hold their people accountable. They will fire people that don't uphold their standards or are found to have fabricated sources or not follow those rules, and issuing corrections when they are wrong. So while I think the media tries to do their best on this, Trump regularly calls the press the enemy of the people, which is just wrong in my opinion. They are holding both him and many people in his administration accountable for disobeying the law. And in fact, many times the media will also hold accountable people from the opposite party. I watched an exchange this week where Wolf Blitzer on CNN was getting after Nancy Pelosi for not pushing through coronavirus stimulus relief. So I think what's great about the press is they bring some of these things to light and make sure and hold people accountable. Trump instead has tried multiple times to bar reputable media organizations away from the White House. He's actually removed their press credentials on multiple occasions. And instead, he's tried to promote fringe groups that are puppet organizations that will cite his data points. And by the way, most of those groups do not conform with the long established traditions of credible sourcing, multiple sources, holding their people accountable. And in many ways, they serve only to promote his interests. And I think it's also been frustrating to see him promote some of these less truthful, media sources, which are really more opinion sources. These are fringe groups that literally will make things up or have little sourcing integrity, and in many respects are just Russian or other foreign actor troll farms putting out, fake news, the true fake news, to inflame our country. And I think this has led to a very sad outcome in that it's degraded trust in sound medical advice during this pandemic, as an example. The last one is the freedom of assembly. Trump has long praised dictators for the strength that they show. In one example, he was impressed by the strength of the Chinese shutdown at Tiananmen Square or other dictators that quell any sort of protest. I want to make it clear that this is an American right. It is not okay to riot or steal or damage property. Those are obviously illegal, and people that do that will be prosecuted. But it is a constitutional right to protest. While there have been some crimes committed during these recent protests over Black Lives Matter, a Princeton study showed that 93% of the protests supporting Black Lives Matter have been peaceful. And by the way, in those cases where it's not peaceful, it's been a little bit difficult to tell if it's been the Black Lives Matter protesters that have caused some of the riots or outside groups, many of which are Trump-supporting groups, that have come in and purposefully tried to stir up trouble. One of the most egregious examples of this was on June 20th, where Trump cleared out what was a peaceful protest on Lafayette Square for a photo op in front of St. John's Church. He's also threatened on many occasions to shut down protests with the National Guard, despite repeated condemnation from both sides of this overreach. Unhappy citizens need to have a way to protest grievances with the government, and this was enshrined in our First Amendment. So those are the ones in specifically Amendment number 1 to the Constitution and our Bill of Rights. And while it's not a specific element of other parts of the Constitution, the other troubling thing that I would say Trump has done related to this is fire over at least 5 attorneys general in his administration. And usually he does this right after they start investigating him or a whistleblower complaint of some sort. While just about every administration has had frustrations with these sort of investigations within their administration, almost all of them understand the value of checks and balances and let these investigations happen because they know that it supports our long-term interest as a country to have those checks and balances. And yet Trump has made it very clear that he doesn't want any checks and balances against his administration. So just to recap, I wanted to highlight a couple of the ways that I feel like Trump has violated the Constitution and the very principles that keep a democracy free and open. Number one, that checks and balances are an essential part of the Constitution, and they keep us a balanced democracy and ensure that no one branch of government has too much unchecked power. Next, that the freedom of religion is what has brought so many of our ancestors here and really was the single defining difference in the foundation of the American experiment versus so many other countries, and that we don't have a national religion. Next, that the freedom of speech is our amazing right. No matter how crazy we think others' opinions are, it's very important to support our abilities to think and believe and say exactly what we think. That the freedom of the press is what keeps our leaders honest and held to account. They have to have the transparency of knowing their actions will be brought to light when they go up against the norms of our society. The freedom of assembly, finally, is our best and legitimate way to congregate and show with numbers in unison where we fundamentally disagree with the things that our leaders do. It must be peaceable, but it also must be protected and helps our democracy highlight the needs of all of its citizens and not just the majority. It's a very critical right, and I think on all of these things that Trump has not shown a willingness to support them. And I think ultimately that tears at the fabric of our country. I believe that Joe Biden has shown a reverence to these principles, even when they frustrated him in prior roles in government. He supports them and maintains that these constitutional foundations are more important than any party or even many specific views within a party. And without them, I think America ceases to be America. And that's why I'll be voting for Joe Biden in this cycle. Thank you.